Well, I hate to be thought of as a know-it-all, but, well, as I used to tell my students, I got worse, but not much. It's a very great pleasure for me to introduce Josh Shenk. And Josh is, in a sense, a product of these symposia, because back when we began in 1998, Josh attended the first symposium, and he told me recently that he was inspired to hear Doug Wilson and Tom Lowry and others talk about new research, new data, not just new interpretations, but brand new information that they were finding about Abraham Lincoln. And he was inspired to undertake a project of his own, and he has, in producing the book, Lincoln's Melancholy. And in doing that, Josh has gone out and gotten his fingernails dirty. He has gone out and done original research in Springfield and other destination resorts. And I used to spend my summers in Springfield, and a newspaper reporter wrote and said, "Believe it or not, there's somebody who spends the summer in Springfield voluntarily." And I explained to the reporter I used to spend my summers in Washington, D.C., but it was not hot and humid enough for me in Washington, so I had to go to Springfield. But anyway, Josh has gone out and did some really original, creative research, finding, for example, that Lincoln's second cousin was confined to a mental hospital at the age of 13. And according to one of the documents that he dug up, which was a hard thing for him to do, and it was very resourceful of him in the Illinois State Archives, it was hereditary. And this helped Josh as he was studying Lincoln's depression. And his book, Lincoln's Melancholy, incorporates this information along with a great deal of other fresh information about the state of the concept of insanity at that time. And it's a terrific book. It has been referred to by the New York Times as one of the notable books of the year, last year published in November. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution referred to it as one of the 12 books that mattered, that was published in 2005. The Washington Post referred to it as one of the best books published in 2005. Josh is now working on a book, a companion volume to the exhibit that the Library of Congress, under the direction of John Sellers, is putting together. Josh also, as many of you know, was the historical advisor to the 3-hour Lincoln program that was aired in January on the History Channel. And Josh's approach to Lincoln I find particularly sympathetic. We heard earlier today from Professor Schwartz that you can think of Lincoln in a number of different ways, as the great emancipator, as the Union saver, as the self-made man, as the vindicator of democracy, all of which are true. But there's one aspect of Lincoln that I personally feel very strongly about, which I emphasize in my book, and which is implicit and to some extent explicit in Josh's excellent book, and that is that we used to think of Lincoln, or it's been traditional to think of Lincoln as an inspiration for those who are born into poverty, that no matter how impoverished you were, you can still rise and become Abraham Lincoln and become president. Well, to my way of thinking, and I think also implicit in Josh's, one of the striking things about Abraham Lincoln is not just the economic poverty into which he was born, but also the psychological poverty into which he was born. A mother who dies when he's 9, a very unsympathetic father, an infant brother who dies when Lincoln's 2 or 3, a sister who dies when he's 18, a sweetheart who dies when he's in his mid-20s, having a terrible marriage. The marriage is just god-awful. No matter what you've been told, it was worse. It's just awful. It's just unbelievably bad. And yet, and then 3 of his 4 children die. Well, actually, 2 of them died during his lifetime. And he said that the loss that he endured, the psychological malnutrition that he suffered as a kid, you can go through all that, and you can still be the kind of psychologically whole, wise, effective person that Abraham Lincoln was. And I think that's an inspiration to us all. And so without further sermonizing, please welcome Josh Shenk.
Thanks to everybody for staying, and thank you to Michael Burlingame for that very generous and warm introduction. He humbly omitted himself as one of the key presenters in that symposium I attended in 1998, which was just weeks into my idea that I might write something about Lincoln. And it was an enormously encouraging experience, not only to see that there was all kinds of new material and all kinds of fresh looks at old material, but to see that the Lincoln community was led by people like Michael, who have as their chief aim a wish to understand this man and his times as clearly as possible, and who will take their work and share it with other people in conversation and symposia like this in volumes, like many of the volumes of primary material that Michael has edited. And I think this is very much in keeping with the spirit of Lincoln, that we're all very small, humble people. And what's big and important is the idea that we're striving for. And in this case, the idea is to touch and understand Lincoln's life and times as clearly as we can. Of course, there's also some dissension occasionally within the ranks of Lincoln scholars, as we have seen today. And you'll be glad to know, for having stuck around this long, that it's one of the regular features of the Abraham Lincoln Institute Symposia that the scholars, after presenting their papers, will get into a pit and mud wrestle. So that's, I think, coming up right after my talk. If you all are tired, make sure you stick around for that. The purpose of my study, Lincoln's Melancholy, was twofold: to understand Lincoln and his times anew by looking at him through the lens of his melancholy, and to understand something of this thing we call melancholy or depression by looking at it through the life of Lincoln. What I came up with is that there is a story to be told that transcends diagnosis or any capsule description of depression in Lincoln's life or in any other life. And by following that story from beginning, middle to end, from conflict to journey to resolution, we can touch something of the reality of his life and something of the reality of the human experience. What helped me get at that story and draw into its contours were the primary documents that I access in many cases by simply looking at the footnotes in Michael's books and in other terrific books, but in other cases by getting my hands dirty as Michael said, in the archives. And he often used this metaphor, and I didn't understand that it's actually not a metaphor, because when you're in there, as many of you know, going through these archive boxes, your hands start to accumulate the detritus, and the table in front of you starts to accumulate all the little flakes that are coming off. But this is where the magic happens. I thought what I'd do today is go through my book and just give you a couple of specific examples of things that I found that helped me dig deeper into the story. And I'm going to give you one example from each of the three stages of Lincoln's experience with melancholy. The first section of the book is about the manifestation of his melancholy in his young years. While indeed his very early life was very troubled, the evidence for his being a man of suffering who stood out from his fellows really began in his mid-20s and picked up steam in his late 20s and early 30s. And we have these two dramatic breakdowns. The second of these breakdowns happened around the time that is commonly known as the fatal 1st of January, 41. That phrase is from a letter that Lincoln wrote. And it's been commonly thought for much of this century to simply refer to his breakup with his then fiancée, Mary Todd. In fact, we don't know what Lincoln was referring to in that letter. He wrote the letter in late 1842. In I think March 1842. And he clearly was referring to this enormously troubled period where he had missed work, where he had talked about taking his own life, where he had provoked radical fears among his fellows that he might kill himself, such that they took actual physical steps to keep him from hurting himself. They also worried that he might go crazy. And in the book, I try to paint a thick picture of just what that meant in his time. And it was really a very palpable and severe fear. It was not a kind of colloquialism that, he might be really, really troubled. There was a very distinct idea of what going crazy meant, and it meant leaving the sane world virtually forever. So what went on around the fatal 1st of January? What caused it? My answer is that we don't know. There are lots of possibilities. There are lots of stresses, personal stresses, professional stresses, political stresses, existential stresses, that probably combine with a inborn disposition to these severe moods, these severe down moods. And my argument in the book is that we don't have to know what caused it to experience the story something of the way that Lincoln experienced it, which is to say that all of these things were a factor. All of these things came into view around this time, and it was kind of like the emotional equivalent of a perfect storm. One of the factors that is often mentioned just in passing is that around this time in January of 41, well, to briefly tell you about some of the other major things, his political career is tanking because he had invested himself in a movement to in internal improvements that had totally fallen apart, and the state was a wreck and might go into receivership. His best friend was possibly going to leave town or possibly going to stay in town and marry a young woman that he fancied. He had a troubled courtship with another young woman, and there was love triangles and quadrangles and pentagons going on in Springfield. And his young legal career was also very much in question. But there's also this question of the terrible weather. It was one of the worst winters on record. And when I went to Springfield to do my research, I looked around and noticed this very peculiar landscape where it's so flat and the sky goes on and on without any break. And I was often there in the wintertime, and I tried to imagine what it would be like to experience that kind of winter. And Lincoln explicitly said that bad weather had proven very severe on his defective nerves. And I wondered how I might capture that. And then one day in the archives of the University of Illinois, I found this letter that was written by a young man who was immigrating from Connecticut to Illinois in the late 1830s. And he was writing back home to his family. And he wrote, this was wintertime, he wrote, "I am sure I have seen colder weather in Connecticut, but I have never seen a place where cold is to be dreaded so much. Imagine yourself in the middle of a large prairie where you might look east, west, north, or south, and where the eye could rest upon nothing above but clouds curtaining down to the earth on every side, and the earth covered with snow. That, he said, plus keen piercing wind, created a dread of cold which words cannot express. And I love that passage because it really helps me just for a moment feel what it would be like to be alive in one's early 30s with one's world falling apart and to be in this really hopeless landscape. The second main section of my book concerns Lincoln's survival and his engagement with the world as it existed, and his construction of strategies to live and even thrive in many respects, notwithstanding his continued tendency to gloom and doom. And there are some medical treatments here. There are all kinds of details about his connection to the medical and the religious, the philosophical culture. The two main strategies that he drew on were humor and poetry. And here, again, is something that is often mentioned, that Lincoln loved these poems, and he loved to recite these poems. And yet, we only get capsules. We get little bits of descriptions, and we get the text of the poems themselves. But then I found at the Chicago Historical Society an actual story of Lincoln reciting his favorite poem, and the story goes like this. He was on tour, on a political tour, doing speaking events with some colleagues, and he encountered this group of singers called the Newhall Family Singers, which was they were one of a type of traveling family singing troupe. And these politicians that Lincoln was with and these singers found themselves matched, going from the same town to town, and staying in the same taverns, and they grew to like each other, and the young women especially grew to like Lincoln. One night they were going to diverge after 8 days together, and they stayed up late singing songs and so forth. And finally, Lincoln's colleagues started to rib him. They said, "Now, Abe, you've been listening to these young women for more than a week, and I think it only fair that you should sing them one of your songs." And Lincoln protests, and I can't sing. And they say, "Well, that's not true. Why, over on the Sangamon, Abe has a great reputation as a singer. It's quite a common thing over there to invite him to farm auctions and have him start the sale of stock with a good song." And the young women get very excited, and they're encouraging Lincoln to sing. And the woman who's telling the story, Lois Newhall, says to Lincoln, I could play any song that you wanted on this melodeon here. Even if I don't know it, I can pick it up and accompany you, because she thought he might be shy. And Lincoln said, "Why, Miss Newhall, if it was to save my soul from hell, I couldn't imitate a note that you would touch on that. I never sung in my life and never was able to. Those fellows are simply liars." And the room grew quiet, and Lincoln was standing near the door that led to the upstairs, and his tall, strange frame was brought into relief by his presence next to this comparatively small door frame. And he finally said, "I'll tell you what I'll do for you. You girls have been so kind singing to us. I'll repeat to you my favorite poem." And he leaned against the door and closed his eyes halfway and recited this poem, which began, "Oh, why should the spirit of mortal be proud? Like a swift, fleeting meteor, a fast flying cloud, a flash of the lightning, a break of the wave. He passeth from life to his rest in the grave." And he goes on to recite the entire poem. I'll read you just one more stanza. For we are the same thing that our fathers have been. We see the same sights that our fathers have seen. We drink the same stream, and we feel the same sun, and we run the same course our fathers have run. Or just one more. Yea, hope and despondency, pleasure and pain are mingled together in sunshine and rain, and the smile and the tear, and the song and the dirge still follow each other like surge upon surge. The last section of my book is devoted to the question that many people's minds would make this project important in the first place, which is, how did this affect his mature character? How did this affect the Lincoln who played such a vital role in world history? And indeed, it is my argument that his melancholy did affect him, although it's hard to strip that into precise arguments, because it's hard for me to separate this aspect of Lincoln's character from his character at large, because it was so tightly wrapped up into who he was and the way that he thought. And there's a strange thing about cause and effect. It's not necessarily that Lincoln's melancholy caused him to act in a certain way. It's also possible that he acted in a certain way, and he was driven to act in a certain way, which deepened his melancholy. This was a man who felt called to do some work that would be meaningful through the ages, that would connect his name to a cause that would connect him to something that was good for his fellow man. So, just in its essence, this is profoundly ambitious and profoundly humble determination to do something that is self-effacing, and to also to wrap himself up in fights. If you're gonna go down remembered, you're gonna have to undertake some pretty big fights, and he did take on causes that many people thought to be hopeless, that he himself thought that his generation would play only a small part in. To me, this business about Lincoln's relationship to the Negroes of his time, as they were called, and to slavery, it really needs to be understood in the context of his sense of his own smallness, and his sense of his own imperfection, and his sense of the deep imperfection of any human endeavor, that there was this terrible wrong that had existed for hundreds of years, and there's only so much that their generation could do. So when he talked about setting slavery on a course where it will come to a point of extinction, and he talked about it taking maybe 100 years. In my mind, this is not a statement of preference. This is a statement of pragmatic reality, that these things take time. And in my mind, if Lincoln were here today, with all of the benefits of our experience living in a multiracial society, on the foundation that he built, that he would be the first one to look back and see all the ways in which he and his fellows were imperfect, just as he was able to see all the imperfections in the founding generation, at the same time that he saw the good that they did and the foundation that they created. Back to another small example of a document that helped me bring Lincoln in this phase of his life to life. Most of us in this room probably know who Kandi Mccullough is. How many of us know who Kandi Mccullough is? Kandi Mccullough was a young woman to whom Lincoln wrote one of the most famous letters of his presidency, which I will read you shortly. And the letter is extremely well known, but it's not well known who she was. In fact, I'd never read a detailed account of this young woman. The collected works tells us that the letter Lincoln wrote was prompted by the death of her father in battle in late 1862. And one can tell from the letter that she is evidently distressed. But who was she? What happened? And how did Lincoln hear about it? And I was thrilled to find letters that told the story and it really helped bring this young woman and Lincoln's relation to her to life. And I'm just going to read to you a brief passage from my book that makes use of these letters. It's late 1862, and it's as dark as can be for Lincoln. He's facing the possibility of serious political opposition from the Democrats, radical lack of confidence from his own party to the point where people are talking about staging a coup. All of the serious and grave military challenges, and the Emancipation Proclamation has been written, and the preliminary proclamation has been issued, and people are seriously freaked about the prospect of him going through with it on January 1st, 1863. And right before he wrote this letter, there's this incredible scene where Senator Browning came to him and found Lincoln in his study and saying, "We are now on the brink of destruction. It appears to me that the Almighty is against us, and I can hardly see a ray of hope." And those of us who know Lincoln and the way he thought know that that's just about the darkest thought he could possibly utter, that he fears the Almighty is against us. Okay, so now to this story. William Mcculloch, a one-armed, half-blind man, had died in a skirmish outside Coffeyville, Mississippi on December 5th, 1862. The 49-year-old Union lieutenant colonel had been riding with his regiment, the 4th Illinois Cavalry, on a muddy road through a thicket of jack oak and brush on a pitch-black night when the 14th Mississippi Infantry, which was hidden in the woods, opened fire. 3 days later, a telegram arrived in Bloomington, where Mcculloch had worked as a sheriff and clerk of courts and raised a family. From the clicks of the telegraph, an operator wrote out the message, "Oxford, Mississippi, December 8th, 1862, Colonel Mcculloch killed in battle, buried by the enemy, flag of truce gone for the body." Leonard Swett was the first to hear of the death. An old friend of the colonel's and himself a veteran of the Mexican War, Swett said that he would have preferred to go to battle himself than to tell this evil news to the Mcculloch family. He especially dreaded telling Fanny. Mary Frances Fanny Mcculloch, the colonel's 21-year-old daughter, was a witty young woman who could be both flirtatiously coy and endearingly earnest. She was slight and pretty, with chestnut hair and wide, dark eyes. And she also had what Swett called a nervous condition, which, with all the griefs attending the death of his dear friend, the colonel, he declared that anxiety for her led us all to forget everything else. Indeed, when Swett delivered the news, Fanny quickly showed signs of what he called nervous excitement. She wrung her hands and cried out, "Father's dead! Father's dead! Poor father! Is it so? Why don't you tell me? Why don't you tell me?" The doctor, Swett said, was sent for. Fanny gradually became calmer. Then she went to her room, shut the door, and sank into a ghastly depression. For days she refused to eat and would not sleep, but alternated, a friend said, between pacing the floor in violent grief or sitting in lethargic silence. You know you're in rough shape when those are your two choices. The Mcculloughs were close with David Davis, and Leonard Swett, of course, is also a close friend of Lincoln's and closer still to Davis. Davis came to Lincoln and asked him if he would write a letter of condolence to this young woman. And he came back again to bug him. And finally, on December 23rd, which was the day after Congress adjourned, and I suppose the first respite that Lincoln had from what he called the extreme pressure of his work, he took a piece of Executive Mansion stationery and he wrote this letter in brown ink with his clear script sloping slightly to the right. Dear Fanny, it is with deep grief that I learn of the death of your kind and brave father, and especially that it is affecting your young heart beyond what is common in such cases. So just pause and note this extremely subtle but extremely important note that beyond what is common in such cases, beyond what is common in the death, the sudden, unexpected, violent death of your father, this is affecting her beyond what is common in those cases. Then Lincoln writes, in this sad world of ours, sorrow comes to all, and to the young it comes with bitterest agony because it takes them unawares. The older have learned to ever expect it. I am anxious to afford some alleviation of your present distress. Perfect relief is not possible except with time. You cannot now realize that you will ever feel better. Is not this so? And yet it is a mistake. You are sure to be happy again. To know this, which is certainly true, will make you some less miserable now. I have had experience enough to know what I say, and you need only to believe it to feel better at once. The memory of your dear father, instead of an agony, will yet be a sad, sweet feeling in your heart of a purer and holier sort than you have known before. Please present my kind regards to your afflicted mother, your sincere friend, A. Lincoln. And this is briefly what I make of that passage, and I'll close my talk with this brief passage from my book. The issues at stake in the Civil War included the future of slavery, the nature of democracy, and the fate of the United States. Lincoln's letter to Fanny Mccullough dealt explicitly with none of these things. But its plain words shine light on the heart of a man who saw suffering and sought to endure it and forge from it something meaningful. Like Fanny Mccullough, Lincoln had long understood himself to be one whose heart was uncommonly affected by the pain of life. Like her, he had often found himself fearing the pain would never end. He had learned from severe experience that suffering had to be acknowledged and tolerated, and that it might, with patience, lead to something purer and holier than could be known without it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Josh. Okay, questions? Right in the middle of the audience.
I was wondering who the author of Lincoln's favorite poem was.
Yes, that poem was written by William Knox. Lincoln himself did not know who wrote it, and it became so associated with him that people suspected that he wrote it. And one of the great texts we have that testifies to his love of the poem is that he was constantly writing it out for people. In fact, the story that I told ends with him writing it out for this young woman. And one of the people he wrote it out to thought that maybe he had written it. Lincoln said, I am not the author. I I would give all that I have and go into debt to write such a fine piece, which was from Lincoln very high praise. But he later found out when he was president that it had been written by William Knox, that it was a self-conscious imitation of Ecclesiastes, which itself is a beautiful poem on suffering and endurance and transcendence. And there's actually quite a lot of literature. There's a book on Lincoln and Knox if you want to explore that further.
After reading your book, I gave 2 copies to people I know who suffer depression, and I knew had particularly tough times in the winter. I haven't gone back to those people yet to ask how it affected them, but my question is, after the exposure your books had in sort of the non-traditional fields, history and history students, what sort of responses have you had, and what have you learned in addition about this condition?
Well, I should say that my favorite part of having done this is being in contact with people who are wrestling with the things that I wrestle with, including this community of Lincoln scholars and historians who are wrestling with the details of history, which I continue to be fascinated by, psychiatrists who are wrestling with treating and dealing with mental illness and mental health, and people, sufferers themselves, who are wrestling with questions of how to live a good life. And I've heard from quite a few people, and everyone's story is different, which is part of what's exciting. And people come to this material with different needs and different interests. The power of the story is that it shows us how complex life is, how things change according to time. People often say that Lincoln was a paradox, and he was, but we're all paradoxes. We all are simultaneously trying to do everything we can to affect our life, and we're also all aware that we're totally out of control, that we're subject to forces. So these two things exist, and you can only make sense of them in a story by looking at people across time. And so some people come to this material, they have suffered and never acknowledged it, never spoken to anyone about it, and for them, it's extremely powerful that this great man, when he was struck down with suffering, told everybody about it. It was exceedingly painfully clear that he was suffering, and he really insisted on attention for a very long time. Other people have come out of the closet, so to speak, but are struggling with how do you live, day to day. And for them, it is striking that in addition to having been so clear for so long, Lincoln, after a time, really stopped talking about it and got to the business of living and working and caring for his family as best he could. And never, so far as I know, after the second breakdown, missed a day of work. He continued to have gloomy spells, but they're all the stories of them all have Lincoln rousing himself when the breakfast bell rang or when it was time for court. So this engagement is also a profound thing. And then, many people who and I have to say these are some of my favorite stories I've heard from a number of people who are suffering extremely and who are performing at a very high level in the arts and scholarship, and they tell me a little bit about how that works in their life, and they often show me something of their work, and that is extremely moving to me. And I may say that my contact information is publicly available on a website for the book, which is lincolnsmelancholy.com. And if anybody's interested, I would love to, and if I don't have a chance to talk to you here, I would love to hear from you. I should also say, in an homage to all the help I've gotten from my mentors in this field, I put everything I could onto all the best sort of history sources that are available online, and gather that together on my website. So that's there too.
Way in the back. Perhaps a more direct response to the questioner's question, which refers to being depressed in the dark days of winter when it's overcast and gloomy and so forth, is something called seasonal affective disorder. And for myself, a chronic depressed person, treated for it for most of my adult life, after about 15 years, when I was introduced to a treatment for that, which is a bright light, and I would look at that for half an hour in the morning, and the change was dramatic. So there clearly is something that goes on internally for people affected by that particular aspect of depression.
Yeah.
And in fact, a lot of people who experience depression get out of the northern hemisphere, or at least the northern part of the northern hemisphere, during the winter months and go south, Florida, Key West. I have some friends that go to Key West and come back feeling better. But there are many aspects to depression, and it's not an easy disease to understand, if any mental illness is easy to understand. But that's one thing that may have been affecting Lincoln, particularly in Springfield, where it was gloomy.
Maybe is one reason why Stewart wanted him to go to Columbia. Seasonal affective disorder is indeed a very serious problem, and it's something that's been studied quite a lot. And we see, in many cases, Lincoln had this kind of earthy language for a phenomena that has become major focus of academic and expert inquiry, as when he said that, in my experience, severe weather has proven difficult on defective nerves, So now we have seasonal affective disorder. And my view is that these diagnoses are extremely valuable, as we can see in this gentleman's case. Very often they help us understand ourselves in entirely new ways. And yet the story is not captured by a diagnosis. The diagnosis is a point of entry. It's one index to help understand the breadth and depth and complexity of the story, but that we really only get to the man, we really only get to ourselves when we see the stories that we live.
I think we'll take one more back there, and that'll be it. But then remember, we're going into a session of questions afterwards.
First of all, let me congratulate you on a study well done. The question I have is, how do you differentiate melancholy from a more clinically defined depression, which may be based on a chemical imbalance? Is there a difference? Is one actually long-term and the other short-term?
Well, there are lots of ways to answer that question. The reason that melancholy is in the title of my book is that is the word that was most often used by the people who knew Lincoln in describing what they saw in him. And when the book is as much as possible trying to draw out his worldview, the way that he saw himself, the way that people around him saw him, and the real texture of that time. I also am turning to modern clinical experience, especially empirical data, where it really seems obviously relevant. But I'm trying to avoid sort of heavy theoretical stuff, and I'm trying to avoid, a lot of questions that are kind of might be academically interesting, but that don't really bear on Lincoln, such as, what would have happened if he took Prozac. That's, to me, does nothing to help us understand the real texture of his life, in which he did take medication. He did take there was medication he took that was available to him, and what did it do? And what happened what happened later? That's so there's a lot more on that in the book, but let me just pluck out one sort of difference between melancholy as it was understood then and depression as it's commonly understood now. Melancholy, the word originates in the Greek conception of human biology and character as being driven by these four basic humors. And melancholy refers to what they thought was one of the four basic substances that affected all life, which was black bile. And in Lincoln's time, there was less and less faith in the actual reality of black bile, but this idea of these basic temperaments was still very much accepted. And the idea was that these temperaments, first of all, everyone was one of these temperaments or maybe a mixture of two, and that each of them had various advantages and various debilities. So the sanguine temperament, for instance, these people were gregarious and fun to be around, but they were also hot-headed and impulsive. And the melancholy temperament, the melancholy character, was prone to self-criticism, to gloom, all kinds of, all kinds of things that are a bummer to be around, but also had access to insight and depth. And this kind of dual quality of it was very much in people's view. They also were very aware of another duality, which was that these temperaments set us up to diseases. So the temperament of melancholy, which is just a way of life, could set one up for the disease of melancholia, which is a lot of like what we call major depression or clinical depression. In modern language, there is this medicine has staked out such a big camp, on our language and our way of thinking, that it's often hard to connect that to ordinary human life, and there's lots of confusion and debate that arises from that. Well, one of the advantages of Lincoln's story is that medicine is really far at the margins, and so this language is one that can be understood in very natural human terms. So that's all a very long way of saying that clinical depression, major depression, those terms, those show up in Lincoln's story, but they're just a sliver of it. The whole thing is much bigger and more complicated and more surprising than just that. So thank you, and thank you all.